Welcome to Cup Chat with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Today, join our Birding with Extension team members and guest Dr. Clint Boal as they discuss owl identification. Hope you enjoy.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us for Cup Chat this morning. I apologize, we were having some technical difficulties. So thanks for joining us this morning for Owl ID with Dr. Clint Boal. And I guess with that, Dr. Boal, if you want to teach us all about how to identify our owls here in Texas.
Okay, well, I guess to start with is what owls do we have in Texas? Okay, and in the United States and Canada, so North America, there's a total of 19 owl species. And you can potentially see, I think it's 74% of those in Texas, because only 5 of those do not ever occur in our state. I wrote down some cheat notes here. So we have 9 owls that are resident species. That's the barn owl, the great horned owl, barred owls, spotted owl, which is the subspecies of the Mexican spotted owl, eastern and western screech owls, ferruginous pygmy owl, burrowing owl, and the northern saw-whet owl. And those birds are here year-round. Some of them are very limited in distribution. In winter, we have the long-eared owls show up, short-eared owls show up, and occasionally, almost every winter somewhere, a snowy owl shows up in Texas, which is pretty cool. And then in summer, we get flammulated owls and elf owls. So the only ones that we don't regularly, we've never, to my knowledge, been recorded here in Texas is the whiskered screech owl, which is much like the western screech owl, but is only found over in a certain mountain range in Arizona and then down into Mexico. The northern hawk owl, the great gray owl, and the boreal owl, which are all kind of northern latitude specialists that don't really get down here. And then the boreal owl, which you could see if you wanted to run over to northern New Mexico. They show up in the northern Rockies in New Mexico. So Texas, it's pretty cool that if you're a birder, if you're interested in seeing these birds, just within the state boundaries, you could see the majority of owls that occur in North America.
So I do have a quick question. So I know obviously like burrowing owls, I've always wondered. So they pretty well spend most of their life on the ground. They really, they can fly, but
they're not penguins.
No, they're not penguins. But I guess my question is do they really migrate like other owl species? Because they really don't seem like they would have their wings don't seem to be designed for long sustained flight.
Yeah, it's a good question. Actually, they do migrate. And I have a colleague at the University of Idaho that has put small GPS transmitters on burrowing owls in Idaho and Saskatchewan and Montana and those areas up in the northern part of the lower Canada. And a lot of those owls migrate right through the panhandle of Texas. He's had me go out and check locations on where he was getting pings from them. We put a couple of those transmitters on burrowing owls from here around Lubbock. I'm stationed at Texas Tech University in Lubbock. And one of those owls, we lost contact with it down in Chihuahua, Mexico. So when it migrated down there, so they certainly can migrate. Now around here, we get some owls that stick around year round as well. But the ones, especially from the north, will migrate through. I think burrowing owls, you find them in the Great Plains going west, and they are in open flat country where they get burrows and like prairie dog colonies and stuff like that. But there's also a subspecies of burrowing owl in Florida, and they even show up on some of the Caribbean islands. And they, to my knowledge, are not migratory, though there have been a couple of accounts of boats offshore between Florida and some of the Caribbean islands having a burrowing owl land on the boat out over the open ocean. So things happen.
Right. There are no
those
absolute.
those little wings can be deceptive.
Yes.
Okay. So what other questions did you have about it? I mean, there's so many owls, we can't, in a half an hour, we can't really talk about ID for specifics. So it might be better to go with questions or some generalities.
So I guess, so one, I guess if you want to, like, so if you have, say, like a great horned owl, so if you just want to cover, so sort of like general characteristics of, say, a great horned owl, will do screech owl, barn owl. We'll start with those. Like, so what are some characteristics, some defining characteristics of, if you have someone who's never seen these owls before, what are their defining characteristics when they see them?
Okay. So barn owls are an outlier. They're a different genetic lineage. Owls are all in the strigiforms. But barn owls are in the genus Tyto, or the family order Titonidae, and all the other owls are in the Strigidae. So barn owls are really kind of their own thing. And they're also pretty unique in that the other owls all have plumage I'll talk about in a minute that's really works to camouflage them. Barn owls are very white or kind of a tawny buffish shade to different parts of them. They have a very heart-shaped face and dark eyes. There's only 4 or 5 owls that have dark eyes. Most of them have yellow or orangish eyes, at least in the North American continent, north of the Mexican border. I'm not talking about birds that occur in Mexico today, because as you get into the tropics, you get a whole bunch of other owls, most that I'm not familiar with. So barn owls are found pretty much around the world. They're very well distributed, and yeah, they're kind of inverted teardrop shape and very white. Usually, most people recognize barn owls because they're used a lot in commercials and advertising and cigar cases and stuff like that. There's stuff. The other owls, which I'd like to spend a little more time on, are almost all some form of tree bark or grass. We have all these companies that come up with camouflage for hunters to use, and none of them are as good as an owl's plumage. And I've seen great horned owls and great gray owls that are perched up against the bark of a tree, and if you don't see them just right, you don't see them at all, because they just blend in so well. And so when I teach Raptor ID with my students, talking about owls is really difficult, because how do you describe, the color of tree bark? It's like shades of gray, shades of reddish, shades of whatever. But typically, they're going to be a darker gray color on the back, and it's kind of a vermiculated shading of gray with some dark shaft streaks or dark crossbars. And usually on the breast and belly, it's lighter with some heavy shaft streaks or crossbars. And there's some variations in that. The people, when we talk about like screech owls and great horned owls, and I'm going to throw a flammulated owl into this. I should throw the short-eared owl in as well. So one of the things people most often notice with a great horned owl is the horns. They've got the ear tufts, and those aren't really horns. They're not really ears. They're just cool-looking feathers that stick up, and those feathers can kind of convey attitude, I guess. it's probably a form of communication between other horned owls, because they may be really erect when they're really attentive to something. They're kind of laid back if they're upset about something. They're kind of, I mean, they do in a way kind of function like dog ears, I guess, in a way, but they're just feathers. Now, the cool thing is great horned owls have those. Long-eared owls have those. And all of our screech owls have them to a lesser extent. But flammulated owls also have them. And it can be kind of tough. Let me go ahead and I'll share my screen and pull up. Just a second.
So you were discussing, while you're pulling it up, so you were discussing obviously with the owls, their back is, you know, a darker color than their belly. So my question to you is, so does that difference in coloration kind of play to like with fish? So like great white sharks, you know, how they have that dark back and then the light belly, so predator or prey species from underneath can't necessarily see them. Is that kind of what we think is why they have a lighter belly?
I don't have an explanation for it. I don't think that would really work for owls, because most owls hunt at night. And so having a lighter belly against a dark sky doesn't make a lot of sense. So it may just have to do, you know, I really don't know. But can you see this image of the flammulated owl?
Yep, we can see it.
If you're just walking through the woods and you weren't really paying attention, you probably wouldn't see this little guy. Okay. And the thing is, he does have little ear tufts. And so a lot of people, if you see a flammulated owl, they're about the same size as a screech owl. They look a lot alike. And so just want to kind of point this out, but you can see, look at the back feathers here, how they're so gray with some dark shaft streaks, and the belly is light, and he's blended in perfectly well with this cottonwood tree. And this is a posture a lot of times in the day that owls will get, is they'll kind of narrow themselves up real narrow. They'll close their eyes, ear tufts will go up, and they'll try to sleep and not be noticed by songbirds. Because if a blue jay discovers, if you're an owl and you're perched up and a blue jay discovers you, your world just got, you know, your sleep got really disrupted, because he's going to call everybody in the neighborhood in, and they're all going to mob you mercilessly until you leave or they just get tired. So the cool thing about flammulated owls is they have completely dark eyes. Okay, so out of all the owls that have ear tufts, the flammulated owl, the easy from a screech owl, is they have dark eyes. Screech owls all have yellow eyes.
Okay.
And there's one in a hand, so you can kind of see how big they are. And flammulated owls only show up in the mountains over in West Texas, like the Trans-Pecos.
So pretty limited distribution compared to the screech owls. Extremely limited in distribution.
Yeah, very, very well. They're more of a higher montane species throughout the western U.S. Okay. Now here's one that we get in Texas. It's very common, the eastern screech owl, and you can see these come in two flavors, red and gray. And why do they come in red and gray? Don't know. Nobody knows. It's thought. So this is a phenomenon we call dichromatism, which means there's two different plumages. And dichromatism is not that common in birds. Now there's sexual dichromatism, where like a male duck plumage is very different from a female duck. Okay. In a lot of songbirds, like northern cardinals, a male is different from a female plumage wise. But if you look at juniper titmice or mockingbirds, the males and females look alike, right? There's no real difference there. With raptors, there is a fair amount of dichromatism. Well, the sexual dichromatism is not pronounced in raptors. In North America, we see it in kestrels, we see it in merlins, and we see it in northern harriers. It's most strongly demonstrated in those species where it's easy to look at them and tell which sex they are. All the others, if there's any sexual differences, it's very subtle, and you really have to look close. But what is fairly common is what we call these morphs. It's a dark morph or a light morph. For example, here in Texas, we get Swainson's hawks in the summer, and you may have a bird that's completely dark brown overall, just a little bit of white markings on the face and throat. You may have a bird that is the typical light face Swainson's, which is all white belly, all white underneath, and it has just a dark bib. And then you get integrates of those. So why that happens, nobody's really been able to come up with there's speculations, but there's no real clear explanation.
I think that's one of the hardest thing about, especially like raptor ID in general, is that there are those different morphs and those subtle variations between individuals that it does make it challenging, especially for new birders or even experienced birders, to be able to be like, oh yeah, that's a red-tailed hawk or whatever, because there's such subtle differences that if you don't get those certain identifying features, it's almost not impossible, but challenging to identify them.
Yeah, one of the things with raptor ID, I think, is that you have to go beyond plumage in those cases. And it's like, what is the shape? What is the posture? What is like the head shape and how it holds its head? And there's always exceptions, but there's generalities that can kind of help you. A dark morphed Swainson's hawk can be very confusing, but if you know that the wingtips on a Swainson's hawk go beyond the tail tip, if you know that the Swainson's hawk typically is a much slenderer looking bird, you can separate that out from a dark morphed red tail and a dark morphed ferruginous hawk pretty easily. But you have to know those things to kind of key in on and have that experience. Right. Okay. Right. The thing about owls is there's only really 3 species that have dichromatism, and that's the eastern screech owl, the western screech owl, and the ferruginous pygmy owl. Sometimes they come in a lighter, kind of more of they're mostly in kind of a reddish phase, but I've seen some pictures where they're more gray as well. But I haven't really seen that really looked at in any great extent. Where we see the dichromatism in the owls is most strongly in our eastern screech owl, like it's on the screen right now. And you have this red one and the gray one. Typically, the red ones are at a more southern latitude, and the gray ones are at a more northern latitude. And there's been speculation that it has to do with, the color of bark on trees, or that in fall, when you have that leaf color change, that a young, inexperienced owl may have higher survival, be picked off less readily by predators if it blends in with like the brownish and reddish leaves or the reddish bark on certain trees. There's not really been any evidence to support that when the few studies have tried to look at it. One of the things about dichromatism is that there's a thing called it's Grogan's rule, but it's from like 1833. And this ornithologist had looked at these animals, the animals that were dichromatic, and he hypothesized that those that were darker colored tended to be closer to the equator, and those that were lighter colored tended to be closer to the poles. And the idea is that the closer you are to the equator equates to a higher humidity level. And humidity is a breeding ground for bacteria that can really degrade keratin, which is what feather and hair and everything is made out of, like our fingernails are keratin. And so his hypothesis was that, and it's been shown that I can't remember the word for it, but it's the pigments that are more heavily, are darker pigmentation, they are more resistant to bacterial breakdown or microbial breakdown. And so the idea is that there's higher microbial loading in animals in the tropics, in the humid areas. And so that darker pigmentation gives them an advantage in that it holds up better to that microbial degradation. How does that work for these screech owls? I don't know. I mean, one of the things that seems to me is if I was going to make a call on it, I typically suspect to see a more reddish phased owl in deciduous woodlands and the gray ones in more coniferous woodlands. I don't know if there's anything beyond just my speculation on that. But it's kind of a pattern I've seen for what that's worth.
I feel like honestly there are some things in science where it's just one of those where it's strictly anecdotal. There's probably no science to back it up, but it's the best we have sometimes.
Yeah, well, I think, if we look at it over evolutionary time and say you have the genetics and say use our eastern screech owl here. If you have these plumage, this plumage that has evolved over time to conceal the owls during daylight, when there's diurnal hunters out and about. Owls are colorblind. And so it's not like the owl's looking at himself going, I'm red, well, I need to find a red barked tree to hide in, or I'm gray, so I need to find a gray barked tree. They can't do that. But what may likely have occurred is those owls that were in areas where you have more reddish barked trees, or deciduous areas where those trees leaf color changes and everything, those that had more of a reddish plumage, maybe they didn't get picked off by predators as frequently. And so there was selection for that plumage for owls in that area. Whereas those that are in more of a darker coniferous type forest, if they were gray, they didn't stand out. And so they didn't get picked out. And so there might have been a response to predator pressure where that plumage characteristic got more highly developed within those regional areas. That makes the most sense to me, really, for our owls up here. I wish I could give you the answer, but a lot of times we don't have the answer. It's like, well, maybe.
Maybe one day we will find the answer, but not right now. So we talked about screech owls. So with the western and eastern screech owl, how do you, obviously call is one really good way to identify to be able to identify an eastern versus a western screech owl. But in regards to like plumage, physical features, is there really a good way to tell the difference?
The ways that I look at is, where am I? Am I within the range of the eastern screech owl or the western screech owl? Because if you see one in the daytime, they're not going to be calling. If you spotlight one at night, they might be calling. But if you see one in daylight, like this western, I know this is a western screech owl. How do I know? Okay. I know because I'm looking at the beak, and the beak gives them away. Beaks on western screech owls are almost all dark to completely black. Beaks on eastern screech owls are yellowish or greenish. And that's about it. That's the only real guaranteed way visually of looking at one. And at least in my opinion, being able to confidently say if it's a western or an eastern.
Or an eastern.
Yeah. There's some people say, well, if you look closely at the eyes, there's a little bit of variation in the eye color. One's a little more lemony, one's not quite as lemony. I've seen lemons that look pretty brown sometimes, so I'm not going to go with that. But the beak seems to work really pretty well.
Okay. So one of my favorite owls here in Texas, I can't get enough of them, are elf owls. So let's talk about how we identify an elf owl from some other guys we have here.
Okay, so I'm going to use my little demonstration owl. Okay, this in my hand. You probably can't. It's not really working. This is about the size of a pygmy owl. I'm holding it like this. Okay, and an elf owl is even smaller. Okay, elf owl is the smallest owl. An elf owl is only from top of head to tail tip is only about 5 to 5.5 inches. And an elf owl, on average, weighs about 25 to 28 grams. That's 0.05 pounds. Okay. I think can't remember. I had this in ounces at some point, but anyways, it's really small. It's a small little owl, and they are just adorable little owls.
Yes.
Things about them is they're only here in the summer. They show up usually in late March. They're in the lower Rio Grande Valley, and they are in the Trans-Pecos, and they are now expanding kind of up into some of the Edwards Plateau areas. They have a funny little call when they're upset. It's kind of like a sneeze call. It's kind of chew, chew. And then they have their little song, which is kind of a little, I can't really imitate it, but it's a pretty distinctive song. And I guarantee you, putting a plug in for Texas Parks and Wildlife here. You go to Texas, you go to the Davis Mountain State Park and stay in their campground in April or May. Well, certainly, I'll say May and June. You will hear elf owls calling at night. I almost guarantee it. They're cavity nesters, so they use old woodpecker cavities or broken off cavities. And yeah, overall, they are pretty much just this kind of, as you see in the graphic here, grays and kind of shades of that ferruginous-y red. They look, if they fly over you at night, you might think it's a big moth. If you're familiar with those black witch moths, they kind of give you that impression. It's like a big moth flittering around.
Yes. So for one of our programs, Birding the Border. So plug for Birding the Border. If you haven't signed up yet, you need to sign up because you can actually see one of these guys. So we go up to Kickapoo Tavern State Park, and there's pretty well always at least one elf owl there. And the one time when I went for our birds, bats, and owls dinner, yes, it's very much when they fly over you, you're like, was that a bat? Was that a moth? Like it's very small. They're very, very small.
It's like a bat, yeah.
Yes.
So there's kind of these browns and grays. Although the browns are kind of that reddish. They have a little bit of white in that upper shoulder area. And they have these distinct white eyebrows. Okay. And they're just really tiny. You know, I mean,
pretty well the size gives it away.
They almost look like a stuffed toy, you know, they don't really look like a real little owl. One thing I would caution people, if you're out at night, someplace where there's elf owls, try not to spotlight them, or if you spotlight them, just be really quick, because they are very small, and pretty much everywhere they occur, there are bigger owls that would be more than happy to come in and make a dinner out of one of them. And so if you spotlight them, you're blinding them temporarily, and you're also kind of highlighting where they are, where like a horned owl or a barred owl could possibly come in and ruin their night. So just a kind of an ethical cautionary thing there. Okay, yeah, elf owls are great.
No, they're probably one of my favorites. I didn't know they existed till I came here and I saw one, and I absolutely love them to death.
One other I'd like to share with you that we have in Texas that I really like are short-eared owls, which they have these little tiny ear tufts. And we have a bunch of them around right now down near Houston on some of the wildlife refuges. People are getting some great photos down there because they're kind of crepuscular hunting. And so if you go out at dusk or go out at dawn, you might see these flying around. And for those people that are familiar with a northern harrier, short-eared owls occupy the same kind of areas that you'll find northern harriers. So like grassy fields and marshy areas. And they hunt, when they fly around, they hunt a lot like a northern harrier. So they're only here in the winter, and it's a neat one to see if you're down in that part of the country. And then all through the grasslands, up through the panhandle, you have a chance of seeing them as well.
So if I hate to ask this question, but if you had to pick a favorite owl that you have, what would it be?
Well, it's tough because I like them all. Um, I especially like the elf owls because I worked with elf owls some over in Arizona when I was a grad student. But uh, I think I would have to say, trying to find it here, this guy, northern hawk owl. We don't get them in Texas. It was one I'd always wanted to see, and I've only seen one nesting pair in my life, and that was up in near Churchill, Manitoba. But they're a diurnal hunter, and they're built a lot like an accipiter hawk, and it's thought that they kind of fill the niche of like a Cooper's hawk. They're about a Cooper's hawk in size, and they occupy a northern latitude where Cooper's hawks don't show up, and so they're kind of an owl equivalent to a Cooper's hawk, and so I think maybe that's why I'm kind of fond of them. I'm an accipiter guy. I did all my graduate work on accipiters, so that might be it. I'm also very fond of short-eared owls as well. So, but
Okay.
if we have time, I want to share one more thing with you.
Yes,
This is
absolutely.
kind of
Go
a cool
ahead.
thing. Okay, so young owls are some of the ugliest creatures on the planet when they first hatch out. And they are the prototypical beautiful swan, the ugly soot duckling, because they're this pretty ugly little thing. I have a friend that's going to hate me for doing this, but look at this. I mean, but look what they grow into. These beautiful, beautiful owls. There's a neat thing because most owls they're nocturnal, and they often nest in cavities of some sort. So picture being the mother or father owl coming from outside, going into a cavity, trying to feed your nestlings. How do you even see them? Well, they've got really good eyesight. It's all black and white, but they have really great eyesight. But one of the cool evolutionary things with owls, and I'm going to use the boreal owl as an example, is as nestlings, as in the nest, they all have some kind of unique marking on their face, like this. So if you're the adult coming into a dark nest and all you see is black and white, if you recognize that facial pattern, you know where the mouth is to stuff the food.
I never knew that.
And let's see, I don't have any of the saw-whet owl. In this case, it's kind of white all around with the dark center. Or the short-eared owl. Now these are ground nester birds. Again, dark face, but these light patterns of down that kind of show you where in the dark you would, depending on the owl species, it'd be much easier to see where do I stuff the food in the mouth when it's in a dark cavity.
So they basically just have a high contrasting face,
right,
to help the parents differentiate where the mouth is from other parts of their body.
Yep.
Cool. Well,
and that holds for most of the owls, at least the cavity nesters.
Okay.
So.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you our final question, and then we're going to wrap up. So the one thing that we're going to ask everybody, we're going to try and ask all of our guests this year is, so when you go birding, other than your binoculars, what is one thing that you always bring with you?
It always depends on how far I'm going and everything. But the one thing I always bring with me is my prescription sunglasses. Because usually where I'm at up here in the prairie lands, it's always bright light. And my eyes are kind of light sensitive. And so I'm pretty dependent on prescription sunglasses during daylight around here.
I can appreciate the sunglasses. That's actually a really good one because I'm very much like you. My eyes are very sensitive to the light. So I'm always like have my sunglasses on, and I realize the binoculars, the eyepieces, like telescopes, so you can look through sunglasses or your glasses, but I can't do that. I always have to, I'm constantly putting my sunglasses up to look through my binoculars, but that's a really good one.
I've gotten really good at using binoculars. I've gotten adjusted to using binoculars with my sunglasses, because if you're up here like we're looking at, something on these prairie grasslands in the summer, it's just so bright. If I take my sunglasses off, it's like you're almost blinded at times. And so I've good prescription sunglasses are not cheap, but for me, it was a great investment. And so unless it's at night or I'm going into dark woodlands, I always take my prescription sunglasses with me.
That's a good one. But all right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us for Cup Chat again. Sorry, we ran a little late. Like I said, we ran into some technical difficulties again. If you haven't signed up for Birding the Border, you need to do that so you can see yourself a little elf owl up at Kickapoo. But other than that, thanks for joining us, Dr. Boal, and I hope you have a great Wednesday, everyone. I hope y'all have a great Wednesday as well, and we will see y'all next week.
Have a great day. Thanks for having me.
Bye.